Are you struggling to figure out that magical picture box we call a camera? Are you ready to pull out what little hair you have left, trying to figure out its inner workings? Then look no further, because in today's video, I'm going to teach you the very basics of how to operate that magical little square of wizardry, and it's going to cost you nothing but one little payment of hitting that subscribe button. Welcome back to Valiant Visionary Studios, the only place on YouTube to learn the art of filmmaking made simple. Today's video is all about that plastic and glass box that we call a camera and how it works. Before we get into all the learning, however, if you're new here and you've somehow stumbled across my humble little channel in your travels across the YouTube multiverse, then welcome. My name is Mike, and I'm a filmmaker with one simple mission in mind. You may have heard it already, but it's to teach the art of filmmaking made simple. If you're a filmmaker or content creator of any sort, then consider subscribing and clicking that little bell icon, because I teach easy to follow and simple video tutorials that will help you level up your creative game. That said, let's jump right into the video. Let's start by talking about the most common types of cameras you'll be using in your creative journey. There's film cameras, and then there's digital cameras, like the one I'm using to shoot this video right now. There's also RED and 4K cameras, but they're not going to be the focus of today's video. Film cameras work by using super thin strips of plastic or other light-sensitive material to both capture and record the images, whereas digital cameras have something called a digital sensor, and they use things like SD cards to both capture and store your media. Digital cameras are used widely among hobby and pro photographers and videographers, whereas film cameras are more commonly used among big Hollywood projects and things like that, although you can find digital cameras on some Hollywood productions as well. Film cameras and digital cameras are really awesome in their own way, but there are a set of pros and cons that are associated with each type of camera, so let's briefly dive into those. Film cameras have the advantage of a higher resolution than digital cameras, and they often produce a sharper, crisper image, but that doesn't mean that digital cameras are a slouch in the resolution department either. Most digital cameras offer 12 to 20 megapixels, so pretty much anything you shoot is going to look really good right out of the gate. Another advantage of digital cameras, my bias is showing a little bit, is that they require far less equipment and gear to lug around, especially when you're out in the field doing client work or you're shooting a short film or something similar, and they're a whole lot more portable than their film stock cousins. Next, we're going to be talking about something very simple but very important, and that is aperture. The aperture in a lens is basically a small hole that controls how much light comes in and hits your camera's sensor or film plane if you're using a film camera. It controls something called depth of field as well. You can control it and manipulate it via settings on your camera, but that's a whole other video. So for now, we're going to be talking about the aperture itself. The more wide open your camera's aperture is, the more light is coming in and making your image brighter. And conversely, when your lens's aperture is closed down, your image will be darker and there'll be less light coming in to the sensor. How wide open or how closed down your aperture is represented by numbers on the back of your camera called f-stops. What's an f-stop? Let me explain. It may sound complicated, but it's really not. So let's dive into it. Now this may sound a little counterintuitive, but the more wide open your aperture is, the lower your f-stop number is going to be. Whereas if your camera's aperture is much tighter and more closed down, it's going to be a lot bigger in number. So for example, if you want a really wide open aperture and a really shallow depth of field, you're going to have a number like f2.5, f4.6, f5.6. Or if you want a really deep depth of field and a much narrower and tighter aperture, Then you're going to have numbers like f11, f15, f18, f22, etc. You're probably wondering what depth of field is, so don't worry about it. I'm going to explain here in a little bit. Now, depth of field basically means the area of your image that's in focus. When you have a really shallow depth of field, only a small area of your image is in focus. You see this a lot with things like portrait and model photography, and in some films where you want to achieve a very artistic and focused effect. Conversely, if you have a deep depth of field, that means almost everything in your image is in focus, and it will be a lot darker as well. When you're shooting with any kind of camera, you're going to have two types of lenses to work with: prime and zoom lenses. Prime lenses are lenses that cannot change their focal length, whereas zoom lenses are lenses that can change their focal length along a predetermined range. You're probably thinking, what in the heck is focal length? Simply explained, it's this. Focal length is the distance between the optical center of your camera's lens and the sensor or film plane of the camera you're using. In other words, it's the distance between the center of your lens and the sensor or film plane that your camera is using to record the images. There, hopefully that's a little simpler for you. Next up is shutter speed. Now, what is a shutter? A shutter is basically a small curtain-like object that's between your camera's sensor and your lens, and that shutter opens up for a very brief amount of time or a long time depending on your settings. When it opens, it exposes your camera's sensor to light, thereby capturing an image. A fast shutter speed basically means that your camera sensor is exposed to light for a super brief amount of time, like say 250th of a second. On the other hand, a long shutter speed basically means that the shutter lifts up and exposes your camera sensor to light for a really long period of time, sometimes even seconds. You can do some really cool things with shutter speeds, such as freeze time or introduce motion blur. Now, if you have a really fast shutter speed like 1/250th of a second or faster, you can freeze time right in its tracks. And if you have a long or slow shutter speed, you can introduce motion blur. Now, you see motion blur in things like sports photography, but motion blur can really be used for a whole lot of things, not just sports photography. The last thing we're going to talk about as far as the basics is something called ISO. Now, what is ISO? No, it's not some super secret spy agency like it sounds, at least as far as I know. Not only does ISO control how sensitive your camera's sensor is to incoming light, but it can also produce something called grain or noise in your image, which is basically just digital artifacts that can really kind of ruin your image quality. So if you can possibly do anything about it, keep your ISO low and only raise it if you absolutely need to. The next couple of basics are things that really don't have to do with working your camera, but I consider them crucial nonetheless. One is a really good camera strap, and two is a set of good ND filters. Oftentimes when you buy a kit camera that comes with a lens, you'll get a really good camera strap packed into the box. Not only do camera straps attach easily to your camera, but they add a sense of security and a little bit of professionalism when you're out shooting in the field, and they help keep your camera in place. These are ND filters, and they're basically sunglasses for your camera. They are crucial for shooting out in really bright environments like the midday sun, and they really are lifesavers when it comes to shooting on the fly. So get one of these in your toolkit ASAP. That's going to do it for today's video. If you enjoyed it, go down below and leave one of these down there, and also comment your thoughts, because Lord knows I really love reading y'all's comments and seeing what you guys think. If you want to level up your creative game and learn the art of filmmaking made simple, then subscribe and click that little bell icon so that way you don't miss a new video from the studio. As always, love you guys, and I'll see you guys in the next video. And don't forget, happy shooting.